There's only one commissioner who's not going to be here today. So again, welcome for being here. I think I said at the last meeting that I was going to sort of dispense with introductions at every meeting as our participants come up, and if they're new, they will certainly be introduced. The first item on the agenda would be the approval of the minutes. They were emailed to you. I don't know if they're actually at the packets, but they would have been emailed. Am I correct? The minutes?
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
I move approval.
Is this a motion, a second? Second from Aaron. Any questions, concerns? All in favor of approval, please raise your hands. They're approved. Thank you. And then it's a structure of the meeting, and I think I can talk about that, a little bit. We're going to give you some updates on a couple of matters. You'll see that there's even an item around maybe additional topics. Brian's going to talk a lot about the community, conversations. Vlad, who is presenting, so I know he's walking through those doors, fairly soon, will be making a presentation. And then this, after the break, at the last meeting, I shared with you the 4 potential topics for subcommittees. Just a reminder, I mentioned hiring, hot topics, 21st century policing. I can tell you that one committee's name has changed since 9 o'clock this morning to now. I maybe talked to some folks about methodology. Well, we're just going to talk about good old-fashioned training when it comes to methodology in terms of breaking that down. And when we get to that time period, we are going to have 4 breakout groups, and we want commission members to be able to rotate and to give your input and what you think those topics should cover as we go forward. I think it will also give those who will not be serving as chair or vice chair an opportunity to hear more about what the work might be. And you can then hopefully make a little bit more informed decision about which committee you want to serve on. And you can serve on more than one. But I have to tell you that if you all decide, for example, you want hot topics, then the chair will use her discretion to move you into other areas, because we want it to be a fairly balanced group. Any questions about that? Brian, do you want to share with us the most recent update on Matrix Consulting?
Thank you. Good news to report. We are in contract with Matrix Consulting, so they are going to be conducting our safety evaluation. Our next steps with Matrix, the first will be, and I think we're looking in September, to schedule a meet and greet with this group and Matrix Consulting. So Matrix will come in, give you an overview of their scope of work, their work plan, and then solicit feedback from you in terms of some issues and other things that we may want to be working on. I'll be serving as a liaison to Matrix, so what we'll be asking of everyone is that as you have questions, comments, things like that for their consideration, those will get funneled through me. So just send it to me and Elon, and then we'll sort those and try to get them to them. We would expect that the first 2 things that they'll work with us on will be some benchmarking and national best practices, likely around training. That would be the next really big topic that we'll take on, and then working with the subcommittees to understand what their research needs may be as we move forward.
Okay. I'm looking at some dates that were shared, but Denise has not circulated those dates yet. Am I correct?
Denise
is on vacation?
Yeah, she's on vacation, so when she gets back, we'll circulate those and get some final dates on the books.
I'm assuming that all of the commissioners are pretty excited about the fact that we will finally have the opportunity to meet and to get to know the folks from Matrix that we will be working with over the next several months. So I'm pretty, again, excited about that. I know you folks all know this, but between our meetings, I meet with what I call the internal team for the commission, and you see 3 of them sitting, sort of right there. And in one of our meetings, and actually maybe this came about because we received something from an outside source, so this is potentially around additional meetings. One of those additional meetings might be on the topic of juvenile issues. And again, one of the things we're thinking, we can see just by looking at the news that juveniles are involved on so many occasions, with the police department. I don't know if we've actually seen numbers here at the commission, around that. And even from the perspective of homicides, many times you will see that so many of our young people are dying before their 18th or 21st birthday. So we'd like to know more about the training and other issues associated with the department and juveniles. So that's one topic. And again, as I raise that, are there any maybe thoughts immediately from the commission members? I don't know if you had thought about this or not, but if you do, again, you can always shoot us an email on that topic. And the other one, I'm going to use this as sort of my working topic. It may change, but sort of race and justice and the disproportionate impact that we know occur throughout the country and in our community. So again, we're going to flesh that out, some more and have some guidance around it. But those are two additional topics for future meetings of the commission. Okay? And now, Brian, I think it's back to you. You're going to talk about the community conversations group discussion.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. That's in the packet. Yeah. Everyone should have in your packet a document that's titled Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission Community Listening Sessions. We've talked briefly about this before, but we wanted to come and present to you what we think makes sense in terms of these meetings, solicit your feedback, make sure that it's really falling in line with how you see these moving forward, and then we'll work with our consultant, Matrix Consulting, to begin scheduling and planning these out. So, part of what we have seen, I think, from everyone who's presented is that there isn't one universal experience of policing in the city of Columbus. It's very much place-based. It is informed by a lot of historical structures and experiences, and we need to get to the heart of that if we want to understand fully the experience of policing, not just from the community perspective, but also from the police perspective. Because we think that those are two critical components and we can't have one without the other. So we're recommending that we do 6 listening sessions in the same places where we have what we call intervention districts here in the city of Columbus. And that's Linden, Hilltop, Southside. Essentially, we would go in and do 2 sessions per community. The first session would be solely made up of residents of that area. And we would want a good diverse mix of background, of perspective, ethnicity, race, gender, all of that, to make sure that it is really reflective of that community. And the second would be with the people who are actually working day in and day out to keep us safe in those neighborhoods, the police officers that serve there. The ideal is that we do a very transparent, focused, and productive dialogue amongst the participants, and that we, commissioners and staff, are there to listen in order to help facilitate real buy-in and input from the commission. We're proposing that we would have a professional facilitator that would get your perspectives, your questions ahead of time, and be able to weave that into what I'm calling light facilitation. This would not be a heavily facilitated, very sort of non-interactive discussion. The facilitator's there to get the conversation started and get us over any speed bumps that we might hit along the way. And other than that, we really want the community to drive this conversation. We want the police officers to drive the conversation. And ideally, what we would get at the end of that is a very good sense of, if I lived in Linden, if I lived in the Hilltop or on the South Side, what would be my experience in being a police officer or being policed in the city of Columbus. And then we would have, I think, a thoughtful dialogue among the commissioners to talk through what we've heard, how that informs the work we've already done, and what we have uncovered and unpacked for future meetings out of those dialogues. So that's sort of the proposal, and would love to get your feedback about that structure and what we think makes sense here.
And we are it's early enough in the agenda and Lad's still not here. We could have some of that conversation now as you think about what Brian just shared with you and get your results. Reggie?
Hi, Brian, I recall an early presentation where Linden, Hilltop, and the South Side had an equal number and the highest number of homicides in Columbus. What is the connection here to the listening sessions and those data?
I think the connection would be with, really where are the places where we have the greatest challenges from the perspective of public safety, where we know that we have, on one hand, from the experience we hear from our officers and from our CLOs, the zone attorneys, and then our neighborhood liaisons. We have folks that care deeply about their community, who are deeply invested in public safety here in the city of Columbus, but it's not quite going the way they want it to go right now. And we need to hear from them, understand what the challenges are, what are the barriers to safety in their neighborhood. We could go to Clintonville, for example, be a very different conversation. It's not that would not inform the work of this commission, but we felt that this would more deeply inform that work.
Two questions for you, Brian. One, marketing to the public. So I know there were the discussions they had in the past in some of those areas. Would this be the same strategy to get just, I don't mean to say like it's but just community members, or is there a targeted group within each of those communities that you're going to be going for?
Yeah, there would absolutely be a targeted group so that it is not just, quote, the same old in terms of neighborhood leaders. We need those folks there, but we also need other and different voices coming forward. So we would expect to work very closely with the Department of Neighborhoods to do proactive outreach and recruitment.
Okay. Thank you. My other question, so I fully support the last statement, talks about holding a group conversation, talking about what we listened, or what we witnessed in the listening session. Would the consultant be at each of these to take notes and gather that information? Or would that be expected that the commission would talk and then present that to the consultant?
So our plan is to have the consultant, they'll be doing many more focus groups like this throughout the city, and we'll also be doing surveys of police and the community. Part of their contract would be to hire a local facilitator. So our expectation is that facilitator would be in charge of running these meetings beginning to end, including your dialogue.
I wanted to just ask that we be in these three particular areas. We have an awful lot of like low-income family members who work weird hours and have children, and a lot of these public meetings are scheduled on weeknights during the dinner hour. And that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for them to be able to attend. So if I know people are not want to give up their weekend time, but that would probably be one of the better times in order to be able to get community members, residents there that have more time and, maybe in a place where there is a playground or something else so that their children, have something to do while they're participating in the meeting.
Yeah, great. Appreciate that.
Do we have either rec centers or, I'm sure we do, we either have rec centers or settlement houses in all three of these neighborhoods that would maybe be good to, children and everything else? And then just in terms of scheduling, Marion, and I understand your point, to the commissioners, I think we should be forewarned in terms of the time that we're going to need to put in. We're going to have subcommittees. Those committees will need to meet, and this type of activity. Again, Mary, I'm not going to say when we're going to meet, but I think your point is excellent. When is the best time to truly get community involvement? And that's what we want. And so my priority would be if we can identify, whatever it is that we try to accommodate that. But our meeting schedule, maybe not all together in a setting like this, is definitely going to increase over the next several months. Okay? Other questions, concerns, thoughts? Yes.
Well, I kind of talk loud, so I don't want to use that.
No, no.
You want me to use it?
Record it.
Oh, okay. Brian, when they did the Linden Community Plan, St. Stephen's provided childcare. So that might be, I mean, that's in Linden, so that could be a location. And I don't know about the other locations if they have that ability to do so.
That's definitely something that we'll look into as a potential benefit. And then depending on the time of day, I know that we generally will provide a light meal depending on when we have the meeting. So something else we'll look at.
And then are you going to address our youth as far as like the high school students in those participating areas, not just Linden McKinley, but Cos and the other schools that are surrounding it, to get their feedback and their interactions? Because when we're talking about police officers, they could be giving interactions from a resource officer perspective and not so much a patrol officer. So how are we going to reach the youth? Because they either have to babysit or they might have a job. How are we getting good data on our young people that could be potential police officers in the future's information?
So that's definitely something.
Add to that. I mean, you just said it. Would it be prudent for us to even have a third session for each community and specifically target, young people? And again, I don't know, will they be open if their parents or neighbors are in the audience to be as open as we would like for them to be? And maybe, again, it's not this type of conversation, but again, Mary, I think your point is an excellent one. But how do we go about getting that? We need to think about it, but
So as we thought about the focus groups that this Matrix Consulting will conduct for us, juveniles is certainly one that we're thinking about. Part of our internal thinking has been that in a more professional, closed environment for a focus group, we might be able to get better involvement and outcome. There's not an audience per se for it. It's really just the facilitator and the kids. So that might be one way to approach it, but certainly something we'll be very thoughtful about and make sure that we're getting as many voices as possible, because clearly interaction with juveniles is an issue that we need to address in our work here collectively as a commission.
yes, Andrea.
So could there be some?
Again, you need a mic.
Could there be some type of collaborative effort with Columbus City Schools and potentially hold those focus groups within the schools themselves? And, that type of collaborative effort, even, I guess, get the teachers involved too, but that could be a very rich environment.
That's a great idea.
One of my concerns on that one is, what about the youth who aren't in schools? And I don't know numbers, but I'm guessing there's a significant number of 15 and older who've dropped out, and they're just in the streets or wherever. And I see a nodding of heads back there. We want to make sure that we can capture their voices.
I think there's one important thing to add to that, to sort of further flesh out what we're hoping to do. We need to work with community organizations to pull these off and pull them off the right way. So that would certainly be a place where we would reach out to some of our social service providers that are providing services already to youth that are not in school. That could be a good place to partner.
For example,
and get that.
Star House.
Exactly. Star House would be a great one, and that also provides a great insight into the LGBTQ experience here in Columbus, which can't be missed in this discussion, especially for kids who are LGBTQ.
I might also suggest too that given that law enforcement and youth contact is pretty much very high in the juvenile justice system, that even scheduling smaller group interviews with the youth who are in the detention center. I mean, Franklin County youth who are held in the Franklin County JDC are likely to come from some of these neighborhoods. And so even if it's just, picking a few of them and doing smaller group interviews, we've used a similar methodology when doing JDAI interviews in counties, where we will talk to everyone who's involved in a court system, but we'll also go into the detention center and talk to the kids, and they get the same questions that the adults get to hear from their perspective as well.
Excellent suggestion. Matt, I think you're is there another one?
No,
That was it. Sean?
And I recognize the point of our work is to talk about public safety from the aspect of our law enforcement in our communities. But what I would offer that might be helpful is looking at other first responders that are in these neighborhoods, particularly when we talk about violent crimes and where other first responders are likely to be called out onto a scene. And I say that to point to some of the research around response rates for ambulance and fire in relation to certain neighborhoods and communities, and how that can impact the treatment, the appropriate treatment and level of care of those in underrepresented and minority neighborhoods. And so I know that our conversation is focusing primarily on law enforcement and our relationship there, but I would wonder, at least in the nation, in the context of how we have these conversations around the intervention districts, what other public sector agencies can be at the table, at least informing the conversation. And I think first responders is a good place to start.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, one question similar to what we're talking about, the closed groups. So it says the other session is safety personnel. Is that just, short of your comment there, LaShawn, is that just Columbus Police you're talking about, safety
Yes.
personnel? We had talked before about officers wanting to speak freely or open, with all due respect, of course, to chain of command, not having some of their commanders there so they could speak a little more comfortably. Could we apply that the same as we're talking about with the children or with the neighborhood leaders to law enforcement as well with this group?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
consider that?
Yeah, we need to have conversations with the full chain of command and especially the chief to make sure that she and the deputy chiefs all the way down the line are comfortable with the structure and all of that. So that'll be happening prior to scheduling these.
Come on out. Well, no, just take your seat.
Yeah, a minute.
You know, you need some water, you need to catch your breath. You brought visitors.
Yes, sorry, I have my kid with me.
Are they well taken care of? Do they have
They're-
snacks? Do they have
they're-
beverages? They're
they're
good? Okay, all right. We were at the point of the agenda where we've been talking about community listening sessions, and so we'll fill you in on that. Great questions and comments from the commissioners. Maybe we'll be adding some more work, for us. Any others on this? Okay. So we are at that point where Vlad is going to present to us his recruitment data analysis. Are you ready?
I am ready. Ready to get it on the computer? I even brought my own clicker.
Okay.
Sorry. So by way of background, I guess, as we're getting set up, I was not at the June meeting when there was data presented on recruitment, and I think there was more questions asked. And so Brian reached out to me and asked, would you be willing to run some more analyses at a finer level of detail and try to answer some of these questions. And so I did my best with the data that's available, and I'll talk about that. And then hopefully, my presentation will be very brief, so there should be enough time for questions, clarifications. Sorry. Well, we'll start with I guess just a little. Yeah.
Our folks back there, the technology people, is Vlad someplace where you can see him? Would it be better if he was?
I can sit. I'll sit up here.
Pardon? At the podium? Okay.
All right. So I do have some slides to go with it. If you read the document I put together, everything is in there. But basically, I was, with the help of the public safety division and the HR people in the police department, I basically got data on all the applicants from the last 2 years, 2016 and 2017. 2017 is a little bit difficult because some of those applicants are still being processed. So what I have is kind of a snapshot based on where they are at the time as of, I guess, early July. So I have information on the applicants, how far along they got. So for 2016, basically that's the last step, unless they made it to the academy. For 2017, some of these people are still in the process. So again, the last step we observe may not be the last step where they end, and that's going to be important. I have separate data on where they're from in terms of their zip code. And I have data on some of their outcomes at various steps in the process. So data on how they scored on various tests, and as I'll show you in a second, also data on applicants that received veterans bonus points. So the city has a policy that if you're a veteran, if you're applying for a civil service job, on the last exam that you take, you get points added onto your score. And so I'll talk to you about that in a second because that's going to be important. So there are things that's not tracked in a way, it's tracked, but it's not tracked in a way that I could analyze in a systematic way. So there's a variety of steps that's in your packet of what it takes to be a police officer. And not everything that happens at all those steps is tracked, again, in a database form. So for example, there's a background investigation conducted. The results of that investigation are presented to the public safety director. But that's not coded in any way that we can see. Again, that information's out there, but not in a way that I can analyze. People take a polygraph exam. They may pass it, they may fail it, and it may be indeterminate. That data is tracked, that's presented to the public safety director. I don't have access to that. So if somebody says something at a polygraph where they admit to doing something that disqualifies them, we can observe that because they don't advance past the polygraph. But if they don't say something that disqualifies them, again, I don't have that data. And when the oral board meets, which is the last step before the public safety director, again, they write some comments to the safety director. I don't have access to those comments. And so I think keeping that in mind is going to be important for how you interpret some of the things I'm going to present to you. All right, perfect. F5. Is this the clicker? All right. That's fine, I can see right there. Oops. All right, perfect. All right. That's not the clicker, all right. So I told you about the data, 2017 again. Keep in mind that it's not quite complete. I have all the test results. I have veterans preference points, and then the limitations I just talked to you. All right, so I'm going to tell you where people are coming from because I think there was some interest in not just from inside versus outside of the city, but by zip code. By zip code, it's all in the document I sent you. Where the bottlenecks are, people that apply to be police officers but don't make it, where do most of them drop off, and by subgroup. And then finally, I think this was the question that motivated the initial inquiry, which is at what steps are there significant racial and/or gender disparities if we're interested in diversity? So yeah, this is where the applicants are coming from. I gave you 2016 because these are the people that made it all the way through. And in 2017, not all the applicants had zip codes that I could match. And so you can see that almost 60% of the people who applied to be a police officer are actually from a zip code within the city of Columbus. And of the people that make it down to the end and are eligible to be police officers, again, 60% are from the city. Another 20% are from the surrounding counties in the metro area. And then another 20% are either from other parts of Ohio or in some cases from Colorado and outside of the state. All right? So there's much more detailed information in the document by zip code if you're interested. This is too small to see, but this is basically every step from the very beginning of the application to the very end when you're eligible for the academy. And this tells you how far each person got. So I call this kind of the terminal step. Right? What was the last step that someone reached? In 2017, that could be the last step they reached as of now, but they could move forward. In 2016, that's all final. Everybody's been processed. I want to focus your attention today on the first couple of columns, so up through the multiple choice exam, because 70% of the applicants don't get past the multiple choice exam. And so I'm going to show you some data on that. And then the other place I want to focus your attention is on the opposite end, on the very last step, which is passing the psychological exam, which is the last thing that happens after someone gets an offer before they get to the academy. And everything else is, again, in the full document. So as we already know, that there are differences. And I want to say one more thing. This is difficult to interpret because the number of people that could pass or fail the psychological exam is determined by how many people got that far, right? So these numbers here are difficult to make sense of, especially if you're thinking about disparities, because without knowing how many are at risk of failing, we don't know, right, whether it's a high number or a low number. So I made you some charts to basically say, what are the percent of the people that got to that step that then make it to the next step, all right? And this allows you to do a more meaningful analysis of disparities. And I started off at the very beginning, which is what percent of people that sign up, that pass a very basic initial screening, show up for the tests. And as we saw again earlier, there's racial differences, there's racial disparities. The bar charts I made are color-coded, so if a bar is red, that means that's a statistically significant difference from the bar next to it. So if it's non-white, it's different from white. If it's female, that's different from male. So in this case, the no-show rate, or the rate of completing a test or showing up for a test, is lower statistically for non-white applicants. It's lower, but not statistically different for female applicants, all right? And this is for each year, side by side, so you can see if there's differences. This may not look like a big number, so about 5% fewer minority applicants show up for the exams, but this is where there's a lot of applicants. So even a small gap at that stage can potentially really reduce the diversity of the pool at that point. So why is this important? We know that there's a high no-show rate. We already knew that it was not the same across groups. But I think one reason why it's important is that thinking about ways to address no-show rates may not necessarily increase diversity if we make this number higher for everyone, right? So for example, we know that the police department is doing a lot of great things like sending postcards instead of just emails, sending text messages, but it's not obvious that's going to necessarily reduce no-show rates more for diverse applicants than non-diverse applicants. And in fact, it could have the opposite effect, right? It could be that, and as we saw in some places that tried postcards, it turns out that men and women don't respond to postcards at the same rate. So again, what I want to emphasize is that reducing no-show rates overall may or may not increase diversity. It may actually make diversity worse, again, if the white applicants or the male applicants are more responsive to those outreach efforts. So again, if the goal is to close that gap, reducing the no-show rate overall may not be the way to do it. As you saw, a lot of people fail the multiple choice exam. And this is, again, one spot where there are big racial differences. So non-white applicants are significantly less likely to pass the exam. And that's because the average score for a non-white applicant is about 5 points lower. I believe the threshold for passing is 59. And so I also, because I had access to the full score, so everyone, I could do kind of a counterfactual analysis. I could say, well, under the current system, we need 59 to pass. What does the applicant pool look like? What if we changed the score and said, what if we only needed 50 to pass? I could actually kind of simulate what the composition of people would look like under that scenario, right? A different passage threshold. It turns out that there really would not be more diversity, at least if you lowered the passage threshold from 59 to 55. If you lowered it to 50, there would be a little bit more diversity, but keep in mind that how candidates do on the multiple choice exam is highly predictive of how they do in later stages, especially the written exam. So again, simply changing the scores to allow to increase diversity at this step might not increase diversity overall, because these are the applicants that would have a pretty high rate of failing on the subsequent exam as well. Again, I'm not saying anything about the validity of these exams. I'm just giving you the numbers and kind of my best way to interpret it. And again, same thing. Other people that pass the multiple choice exam, there's also in the subsequent stage some racial differences and some gender differences on passing the written exam. We don't have scores, the raw scores, we just know whether you passed or not, but you can see again that non-white applicants are significantly less likely to pass the written exam. There were some concerns, I think a couple of meetings ago, that maybe there's a lot of disparities at the most discretionary steps, right? The multiple choice exam seems pretty standardized, the written exam is standardized, but then there's the oral exam, and there were some concerns that maybe at that stage there's racial disparities. Turns out that's not the case. Of the 3 exam phases, the oral exam, the COPE exam, is the one where there aren't significant racial differences, and women tend to do significantly better than men at that stage. All right. So again, if we're thinking about the places where we get less diversity, the written exam and the multiple choice exam are big areas. The no-show rate is a significant area. The oral exam, not so much. So I mentioned that this is the only I had access to the multiple choice scores, but those raw scores aren't actually used in the application process. People just get a pass or fail. The only place where they get a numerical score is from the oral exam. And if you're a veteran, you get extra points added to that oral score. So I was able to get data on who the veterans were in both years. And it turns out that white applicants and male applicants are more likely to be veterans. So again, it's not to say that the veterans' preferences are a bad policy, but it does, I think, suggest that there's some trade-offs, that having veterans' preferences could potentially, especially on the gender front, make the applicant pool less diverse. Now, this only really matters, right, for applicants who are right on that threshold of being in a higher tier, because or the higher band. There's the 90 band, the 80 band, the 70 band. So it's not obvious to me that this is a big impact, because again, these points only matter if they take you from the 80 band to the 90 band, or from the 70 band to the 80 band. And probably for many applicants, that's not the case. That without the points, they would still be in the same band. But I didn't quite have data to do that kind of analysis to figure out would the relative rankings change in the absence of these points. But I did want to flag this for your attention. All right, so there's a lot of stuff that happens after the exams. Ultimately, the public safety director makes offers. And at this stage, again, there were some differences, but not significant differences by racial group, and the gender differences were different across years. So I wouldn't make too much of these red bars. Why is it that of the people that get down to that level, that non-white applicants are less likely to get offer? Again, we can't tell you that because a lot of this information, again, isn't tracked in the way that's in a database form. So it could be that maybe something during the background investigation comes out at higher rates for non-white applicants. Maybe the polygraph test outcomes differ. Maybe the oral board results differ. We don't have access to the oral boards. So the oral boards are different from the oral exams. The oral exams are at the beginning. The oral boards are after the polygraph. And again, there's notes given to the public safety director, but nothing that's tracked in any sort of numerical form. So maybe all of these things can explain why we see these differences, and maybe there's perfectly good reasons. So again, I just want to caution you about making inferences about why these differences exist, but here are some possibilities. And the last thing that I found really striking is at the very last step. So again, 98% of the people have been eliminated. People have gotten offers. Some of them did not accept the offers. Some of them have. Then they did the stress test. The very last step is passing a psychological exam. And here we see, especially in 2017, but also in 2016, pretty big differences between male and female applicants and white and non-white applicants. And because, again, this is the very final step, and there's, again, not a lot of people left, I think this gap, to me, was really surprising, and the staff that I talked to really, I think, were surprised as well. And I don't think any of us really know why this is happening, why male and white applicants are passing the psychological exam at such higher rates than everybody else. So that's kind of the highlights for you. I'm happy to answer questions that you may have. Yes.
Vlad, great report first. Great report first, Vlad. With the testing, I often worry about bias in standardized testing, and especially multiple choice ones. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Has there been any instructional design with designing these tests so they're free of cultural or other kinds of biases that might exist? How do they control for the fidelity of these tests?
I can't answer that because I actually don't know what questions are on the test. That's a question, I think, for other folks. But I would say that, even if the test was perfect, if there's no racial bias, we would expect racial differences because race is correlated with other things that predict performance on these kinds of tests, right? Like socioeconomic status, et cetera. So it could be that there is racial bias built into the test. It could be that the test is perfectly fair, but again, non-white applicants are just different across other dimensions that correlate with the race and ethnicity that also predict test performance. And I think the question maybe you're getting at is, how valuable is a test? Is it getting at predicting the things that we want to predict? Again, that's not a question for me.
Okay.
I would say that we are seeing differences on the written test, and I don't think that's multiple choice. And that's, I think, trying to get at ability of people to write clearly in a report that's later used as evidence. So I think having written skills is something that's probably very important. And there are racial differences on that as well. But again, I don't know anything about the content of the multiple choice exam, so.
So you basically see a similar trend with the oral test, with the written test, and the
It's
multiple
very highly
choice?
correlated, I would say. So, again, we only observe the written test scores, at least I observe the written test scores for people that pass the multiple choice exam, which is 59 or higher. But even within that range, there's just a very strong relationship between how well you did on the written test and whether you pass, on the multiple choice test, and whether you pass the written test. The probability is, it's every point increase, your probability of passing the written test goes up by 1. So it's all very, very strong. So again, unless there's the same kind of bias on both tests, that could explain the correlation, or it could be, again, that the tests are picking up something else, some other underlying trait that happens to be correlated with race and ethnicity. Yeah.
I don't expect you to know the answer to this question, but I'm hoping somebody here might. Are these tests owned by CPD, or like many other departments, are they a purchased product that is then just brought in for standardization?
No, I can answer that. Those tests are developed by the City of Columbus through the Civil Service Department. We have a safety testing unit that's within my agency here, and they develop all the tests. We have subject matter experts that come in that help us with that. We also send them out and have them reviewed by other experts. And we have found that we have actually less adverse impact than most of the tests that we buy. That's why we develop them here. We also, because we go through our validation process, have had no lawsuits for those things like bias and other things. I think what we found when we look at our tests and where our cutoffs are, we do a 1 standard deviation when we score them, which if you want someone to talk to you about that, it's not me.
I'm happy to talk about it.
You can talk about
I'm just kidding.
We do that, and we look at that cutoff point, and we've played with that cutoff point over the last 7 years when I've been here at that multiple choice to see if we lower it, if it's going to help our diversity standards. And what we found is when we lower that level, those individuals are having difficulty making it through the academy. And it also plays in at the test that they have to take at the very end after the academy. So as we're,
Talk more about that. What is that test at the very end?
the state test that they take, I don't know all about the state test.
Well,
You
but I mean,
probably,
there's also a test at the end that you have to take with OPATA that you have to pass in order to become a law enforcement officer. So even if we pass
I knew
folks
that.
on, if you don't pass the final, kind of like the bar exam, if you don't pass the final exam, you cannot be a law enforcement officer.
That makes complete sense.
I'm sorry, I thought you wanted me to give you the details of that
Yeah.
test, and I'm like, I'm not taking that test. I wouldn't.
I'm just kidding. The reason I was asking that, that's kind of what I hoped. I feel like we have more flexibility if there's a recommendation or something from the commission versus a standardized test that's just purchased. So
Yeah.
that's helpful. That answers it.
We've done a huge job in trying to actually put all of the information that's on that multiple choice and on that writing sample actually in a study guide. And I would say probably 90% of everything that we test is in that study guide. So I think we try to eliminate bias and all of that by providing that information. We also are trying to do study sessions and information sessions so that all of that information is out there for everybody to have access to.
And if I could just jump in.
Thank you.
So my point about lowering the no-show rates may not increase diversity. I think it's worth thinking about some of these other things as well. Having study guides out there may reduce racial disparities. They may increase them depending on who's actually using the study guides. Having study sessions, again, may reduce disparities, may increase them depending on who's showing up for the study sessions. So I think that's just worth thinking through, right? That things that sound like they might have a positive impact could backfire depending on what actually happens. So I think tracking that data is really important in evaluating these changes or evaluating these things. Keeping track of who's showing up and how they compare to the overall applicant pool will tell us whether the study sessions are having the desired goal, whether they're having no impact, or whether maybe they're having a negative impact. But again, I didn't have access to that data.
Thank you both.
By what process did you follow to set your thresholds for statistical relevance?
So you're talking about the color, the whether it's red or not?
Yeah, what was there?
Yeah.
Was there a threshold or cutoff that you followed?
Yeah, so I used to use what is kind of the standard threshold, and it's basically the probability of that difference being that big by chance is less than 5%.
Okay.
Right. So that's kind of if we got 100 of these data sets from 100 departments, and there's no differences in reality, what's the chance of getting it at random? It should be less than 5%. So it's pretty, I would say it's pretty high standard proof. So if there is a difference that's not significant, we shouldn't overlook it because again, I'm using a very strict definition of significance.
Yeah.
It could be a big difference that has real impact, but it may not be quite significant. But again, it's still a real difference that we should care about.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, I don't think. Do we know what percentage of minority applicants have college degrees versus non-degrees?
So I just got data on, unfortunately, that's not tracked except for the people that make it down to the public safety director review. So I have that data. I haven't looked at it yet. But that, again, that only tells us information about people that make it very far along. It doesn't tell us any information about, 90% of the people that drop off before that. So maybe tracking that information going forward, I think, would be helpful as well.
So you're saying you only have the stats once they make it to that certain level?
No, I have stats for educational attainment, if we went to college or not, and
Right.
if for some people what their major was. So I didn't give you any of that data.
But we do have that.
For people that, 100 people that get down to the public safety director review. We don't have it for the 3,000 people that fall off before.
Right.
As far as I know.
I thought we did at one of the past sessions when we were in the basement of the rec building, maybe, whoever presented there. I thought we were given that information.
Oh, the
I
Civil
don't-
Service Commission.
Is there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, at least what the public safety division had was only limited to people that made it to the public director review.
Those were either recruit classes people have gotten in, we were talking about that, it's most likely half of every class is a college degree.
Okay.
We don't know that number by race.
Okay.
Question for Amy. What psychological exam do we utilize, and aren't there other exams out there?
Are you talking about what do our experts that we send them out to use?
Yes.
I have no idea off the top of my head. I know we looked that up, and I have that information if I dig in my file there. I think they use 3 different types of psychological tests. That's something that we're looking at right now and have asked them specifically, and we're waiting on getting information back from our psychiatrist now.
Gotcha. And aren't there a number of those different types of those exams?
There are tons of different exams and exam types that they use. I know there actually is an assessment that they come in and do that's manual, where they have to answer questions. For example, it should take around an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on who's taking the test. People who have not passed it have actually came back a second day to try to answer those questions, and automatically they did not pass the test because they thought if they have to think that hard to answer the question, then they're probably not going to be appropriate for this at this time in their, and that was just somebody recently that I questioned because I thought, based on everything I saw, that she would probably be a really good applicant. So it's surprising what you don't see when they're somewhere else other than meeting with you face to face in different meetings.
Yeah.
Have you done any analysis on the psychological exam from the standpoint of if we were to eliminate the disparities or the disproportionality that lives within that particular context, how might that change the disproportionality that lives in the overall process in terms of completing it successfully?
So I haven't done any of that analysis, and again, I don't know anything about the psychological exam. I only know who failed and who didn't. But I would say because it comes so late in the process, right? That's the people that made it through all of the other hoops, right?
Right.
So I think
So
that it won't address the disparities in the multiple choice testing, for example, because it's only limited to people that
Population
pass the test.
size is not
Yeah.
large enough that if we close that gap, it somehow reconciles the broader gap that we're talking
Right,
about.
because again, that's the people that make it to the last step. So
Yeah.
the people that, all the other gaps have already happened, and at that point. So fixing the gap there won't undo the gaps earlier, is I guess the short answer. But again, I just want to be clear that I have no idea why these gaps are there, right? There could be perfectly legitimate explanations. Right? I don't know what's on the test. I don't know I only know the outcome. So I want to be clear, I'm not making any inferences about why this is going, whether this is legitimate or not, whether this is unfair or not. I'm just giving you the raw data.
And
We truly, excuse me, want to thank you, but by raising some of these additional questions with the hiring subcommittee, this could be, areas where they would want additional information, research, or whatever. So you're helping to bring those issues to the forefront. So thank you. Yes.
So my question becomes, when we collect data around post-high school graduation, college degrees and things, do we get any other demographic information on, like socioeconomic information on these individuals, the applicants? Because I think those variables probably speak a little more accurately to why people perform on tests differently. And to this degree, to a statistically significant degree, than probably race.
So I didn't have access to any of that, so I don't know what else is collected. The closest I can give you was information about that zip code. So it gives you a sense of the socioeconomic status of that zip code. But I think what you're saying is exactly right. That again, there's things correlated with race and ethnicity that are going to affect all these things. And then the question becomes, well, how do you balance that, right? How important is passing the written test? How important is it getting a 59 on the multiple choice test versus not? And that's not a question I can answer, right? How valuable are these predictors of the qualities that we want police officers to have? And again, I'm not the right person to answer that question. I think that the other folks here can speak to that, and maybe that's something that the subcommittee will want to look at. One of the things I was curious about is we have data on the people that passed the tests. Again, they all passed, but at least for the oral exam and at least for the multiple choice exam, there's variation. There's somebody that got 59 versus 100, and if we track them over the first few years of their career, how well does it predict their performance, right? If somebody gets 100% on the multiple choice test versus 59, does it have any predictive validity in their performance as a police officer? And I think that kind of data would be really useful to speak to, right? What is this test measuring? Is it predicting the kinds of things that we want to predict to help us select the officers we think are the best officers? But again, I didn't have data on what happens. I didn't even have data on what happens at the academy, right? This is data on what happens once they're a police officer, and I don't know whether that data is tracked in a way that would allow that kind of analysis. But I think that's something that'd be interesting to look at.
Right, and I kind of wonder about also diversity in engineering, like going back and deconstructing. Once you get an officer on the force, looking at their background, like where do these officers come from and what was their upbringing, these types of things, because this might also provide some prediction of how we can better recruit for future officers and have predictions of who will be successful and who may not be.
And again, I don't want to take too much time, but I think Deputy Director Speaks had the same kind of question. He said, well, can we find the profile of a successful police officer? Right. The problem is, right, we only observe performance for officers who are officers, right? For example, college. We don't, at least I didn't have data on college degrees for people that failed. We know that half the police officers may have college degrees. What if 90% of those who failed exams also had college degrees? That would mean that college degrees are actually a bad predictor. Because we don't have the data on people that aren't police officers, it's difficult to kind of draw those conclusions, right? We need data earlier on before they become ineligible to be police officers. I think those questions are really difficult to answer because it's kind of what we call selection bias, right? People that get that far, we don't observe the people that didn't, so we don't have any comparison group.
Was there any correlation or any data you had that looked at age? So for example, someone who's interviewing, goes through the process as a 21-year-old versus a 30-year-old may have different life experience. They've done more interviews in their life. Did that correlate?
I didn't have access to that.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's collective, but I didn't have access. So the only thing I had was race and gender and zip code. And I have names. I guess I could, yeah. So names don't tell us age. So yeah, so that's really all I had, and the performance on the tests.
Okay.
So again, if that data is available, that may be for the subcommittee a useful thing to look at.
Any other questions? Glad, thank you so much for doing this for us. Thank you.
Did your kids help with the report?
I wish.
It's a little early for the break, but to me, it might make sense for us to take a short break now. Then we'll come back and we'll sort of divide up before we really get into the tabletop conversations. I don't want us to start and then to have to stop. So let's say we're going to break until 4:15, and then we'll come back and when commissioners come back, are they going to be seated at tables? Maybe there's some information I should share with you. I can see Elon and Brian like, wait a minute, you need to tell folks some things, right? Okay. So let me share this. Who will serve as chair and vice chair of the 4 committees? So for the hiring committee, I want to say thank you to Andrea Amorbitzer for chairing and Sean Carter for the vice chair. Methodology, that is now training, Brooke Burns will chair. Matt McChrystal will serve as the vice chair. 21st Century Policing, Dr. Chanel Jones will chair. And thank you, Officer Tracy Shaw, for saying that you will be the vice chair on that one. And then under Hot Topics, Vlad, we've got you working again. You will serve as chair, and Dr. Wilkinson has agreed to be your vice chair. So and we didn't really talk about this, but certainly I think that at least the chairs of each committee would want to stay stationary at a table as the commission members rotate, so you can get as much input as you can from all of the commissioners. Not as necessary for the vice chairs, I don't think, if you wanted to go check in on some other ones also. So we'll get that arranged. Am I missing something?
I would say groups of like 4 or 5.
4 or 5?
Even yourselves out in the first group, and then we'll make sure to call when the rotations come up. So
Okay.
make sure you just visit each table, though.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So we'll get that done when we come back.
Yep.
All right. Quick break. Thank you. Who wants to get started? And let me ask you this. Should we have we can have it as structured as having the chairs share their thoughts, or we could just have kind of an open conversation?
Yes.
Okay for an open conversation? Let's just have an open conversation. And chairs, you may still, be picking up on issues. So who's anxious and ready to share?
Okay, so do you want us to share as a committee then, or as?
No, just as members of the commission in terms of what you've heard. So we're not going to do a report out from the actual committee chairs. You've got all of that information that you can need, but just from the participants, I don't care on which topic.
Oh, sorry. I just think it's critically important. I mean, what I realized while we were talking is so many of these things bleed into each other, and that we want to be really careful about the duplication of effort in terms of, because what we talked about in hiring bleeds over into training, bleeds over into hot topics, bleeds over into 21st century. So just to be mindful of sort of the separation of work and that we're not doing the same thing in 4 different committees.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, I think when we chatted at the very beginning, especially your committee, 21st Century is absolutely over everything. And one of the things I was just talking to Elon about, but we will leave this up to you in terms of a homework assignment. Elon was sharing that it's President Obama's report is really a good one to read. Easy to read, 100 and some pages, but maybe
It's like 111.
111. She knows the exact number of pages. I'm not sure what that tells us about her, but anyway. But you might, so at the next meeting, you're going to give this overall presentation that we talked about. Maybe this particular report or another one might be a good one for commissioners to read before they come to that session. Mm-hmm. So I won't put you on the spot today, but we would actually like you to, again, to get some more in-depth information in these areas. And so we will plan on that for the next meeting. But actually, an excellent point. We've got some logistics we have to figure out here. We have a lot of logistics we have to figure out as we move forward. Vlad?
So, one thing that came across to me, at least during a lot of the conversations, is that there's a lot of perceptions and a lot of beliefs that we have, that maybe the community has. And it seems like one of the useful things we can do is kind of take that and then compare it to the reality, and then communicate that back to see, here's the perceptions we have, and those are actually correct, and here's the perceptions that we have, and maybe they're not correct. And so I don't know if that's a committee thing, but just comparing what we think is true to what's actually true, and the documenting, I guess, if that makes sense.
Well, I would say that from the very beginning, just something that I knew is that we know that there are certain perceptions in the community about the police and possibly the other way around. So how do we address it? In a way, that's our work in many ways. Others?
One thing we saw in a few different was best practices, talking about what's going on nationwide, whether it's officer safety, making sure they have tourniquets and training, whether it's hiring actual training. I think especially with the consultant coming and that report, I'm glad you brought that up, looking at what other agencies that we know of are doing. Some are struggling with hiring millennials. They're struggling with hiring younger persons, especially as community shift. Columbus is getting a lot more folks not from Columbus moving here. Looking at how we're adjusting to that, making sure we're looking at the future, but also a huge impact in all three areas was talking about looking at the past. We have to make sure that everyone, officers exist, not officers exist, current officers and officers that are coming in through the training academy know what the history of Columbus is. And I don't know if that's taught or how in-depth that's taught, but knowing our community, our demographics, our history here.
Okay.
One of the things that I picked up in our conversation was us getting a chance to hear from those that work in 911 dispatch and operators, serving largely as the front door of community engagement and kind of helping us understand what role they play in as the front line to police and community engagement as they respond to calls as they come in. So just having an understanding of how the 911 department is composed and what role they play and what training they receive in relationship to the community and as calls come in.
There was an article in the Dispatch within the last 60 to 90 days about our 911 center, how understaffed they are. They actually gave the salaries. So many people are, I shouldn't say so many, several of the employees have a significant amount of overtime. So they actually gave salaries that were probably pretty startling to some people in terms of what they would have made in 17 and 16. But I'm not concerned about the money as when you're constantly pulling double shifts, how are you as that 911 operator communicating, to police and to others? The tone, just everything about it. So I think it would, I agree that we should have someone to come in to talk about that. Now, if it's to talk about it or how it would be, just put it down as a topic, and then we figure out what it is that we need. Aaron?
In all of our different lights, so there's one of these things that seems to be slicing across all the different working groups. But I think it has some pretty significant impacts and we should look at and make sure we're capturing.
Is that just officer wellness in general?
It went everything from, kind of staying healthy, mental health, stress in life, financial well-being, so a pretty broad slice in different.
You may not be on.
Why not? Sorry.
I'm just thinking as we put committees together and all the work that we're doing, it can sometimes seem like, we're here to, find areas that are badly operated or not in good shape. I'm hoping that we also recognize the things that are being done really well. Compared to some police departments around the country and around this state even, I think Columbus does an amazing job. So I don't think we ought to focus on just what we think are deficiencies, but actually point out the kind of things that are working well. Not that they can't be enhanced at some point, but we should call it what it is. If they're doing great stuff, we ought to say great stuff is happening.
I agree. Anything else?
One other thing we had talked about, a few different groups, was some support. So Is Jeff Furby still here? No, Jeff, oh, there you are. Jeff Furby did a great job with his legal overview a couple months ago, but we may need some more guidance as far as how do we change some of the laws for hiring, some of the laws that no longer exist, some of the, help me out, somebody was over there, City Commission Code? Charter, thank you. The charter, and then also looking at how we enforce some things such as marijuana is coming to Ohio, right? Legal marijuana. How are we going to enforce that? The open container laws that exist, some things that really just don't need to be enforced or don't need to be laws. We all know there's laws that shouldn't exist. How are we addressing that as far as zero tolerance and enforcement, and then changing those to make sure that we can act within those?
A few weeks ago, I was, I don't think it actually made it to the local news, but it was circulated in social media. And I was out and someone knew I was on the commission and shared it with me. So when you mentioned the open container, it was a situation, I think it was around 8 o'clock in the morning. Got to get my right streets.
High Street.
High and Long, which is actually very close to the YMCA and also the Southeast Community Mental Health Center. And so I watched this escalate, and my thought was, why did you stop your cruiser at 8 o'clock in the morning for it appeared to be someone who maybe had an open container? I literally was like, I'm not sure, is that in training or policy, but a fairly, I was looking to see, was the person falling down drunk or this or that or harassing anyone, didn't see it. But again, that was one of the, where's the judgment in what I would consider a fairly minor infraction, unless there was more to it than what I saw, because it ended up with several cruisers being there, the gentleman being tased, and is Jeff still here?
Yeah. We had a robust discussion about those videos.
Oh, did you? And that's what I saw. But I actually have a question, because let me just ask it without prefacing. Is it the law that if an officer asks you for your personal information, you must give it?
Yes. If they're being legally detained, they have to give their name, date of birth, and address.
So can you repeat that? Because those are two different things. So you said if an officer asks you for your identification, you do not have to provide it unless one of those three things.
If you're being legally detained, you have to give your identifying information.
Correct. Okay.
Response be to ask the officer, am I being detained? And then see what the officer response is to the question of, am I being detained?
Yeah, and have you seen the video, I assume? The guy, I think, asked, am I being arrested? There was a discussion, and the officer said...
Saying, where's the container?
Yes.
The guy kept saying, where's the beer, where's the beer? He had handed it off to somebody. It was what it appeared. That we had a robust discussion about that, Jan. I think that's a great topic to talk about.
Maybe had a right to, but just in the grand scheme of things. It's like when you're a parent. You figure out
The battles you want to fight.
yes.
Right. I'll give you the 5-second other side of it, though. Who do you think can ask the police to enforce open container law in a downtown corridor?
The businesses.
The businesses. We get pushed at very hard by the downtown special improvement district, those people, because they see open containers at street level, public urination as driving away people who come into town to do business. So the police get a lot of pressure from those groups to enforce those laws strictly. So I agree with you. We watch like, oh, this turned into that from an open container.
So my intention was definitely not to open a can of worms as far as right or wrong or which side. Somebody said at one of our tables, and I think this is really the key thing I was driving at. It's protect and serve, not police and serve. And so, one, I don't think open containers should be enforced at all if there's already laws that say if you're just drunk and disorderly. But it's really that thing. It's protecting and serving. So when we're training officers, when we're hiring persons to become officers, it's that mentality of protect and serve, not police and serve. The relationships we need to build. That was also talked about at a lot of tables. We need to make sure through the whole process that you're here with the community, not not as a stormtrooper amongst the community, but you're really there with them. So that's what I was driving at. Like I said, I didn't mean to get into the specifics of that.
We had the very same discussion, to be honest with you. I mean, we see these videos, and we're more sensitive to them than anybody. When we see them, we're like, oh, you know, how much trouble is this going to cause us? How bad does this look? How do we deal with this? You know, so we're very conscious of those. The minute we see them, we're on top of them.
And the last one that I saw, and it was not Columbus. I think it was within the last 2 weeks. I think it was Baltimore.
Yeah.
It was Baltimore. And again, I thought the one thing was that the gentleman refused to give his personal information. And of course, in this case, it escalated to just a beating and an officer who has resigned. I mean, it was pretty vicious.
It was.
One of the issues that we run into with this is that when, like, businesses downtown ask the police to enforce open container and deal with public urination, well, the problem is we don't have any public restrooms down there, and the businesses that are restaurants and things won't allow anyone to come in and use their restrooms unless you spend money, which means people have to panhandle in order to be able to use a bathroom downtown. I don't even think our city is all that welcoming for events downtown if you've got to spend money just to use a bathroom. So I don't think it's not fair to ask the police to enforce something that we should be addressing in a completely different way.
I'll be honest, I don't get into the philosophical issue. Right. The police hear, hey, we're seeing illegality, these are on the books. And that's a good question, what should be on the books? Mm-hmm. The chief and I have had this talk many times. There are a lot of laws which we know are troubling. It's hard to tell an officer, hey, that whole range of laws that cause us trouble, don't enforce those. Those need to not be there, otherwise you get into, you know,
right? I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of laws that we don't enforce.
There's a whole range of them out there that are controversial. They're on the books though, and they're regular things the police see. So either, I mean, the officers say it's on the book. You know, it's illegal to have a cracked windshield. It's illegal to have a loud muffler. You know, you have to have a front license plate. Those are all on the books in Ohio. They don't have to be on the books, but they are.
Right.
It's hard to say to officers, ignore parts of the code that some people don't like.
Right.
So it'd be better off that what you recommend is some of those things not be there, to be honest, in my mind.
That's a legislative thing.
Yeah, that's a legislative thing.
Well, that's,
yeah.
No, I agree. And that's what my comment that brought all this up was, is that we need to look at the charter and the laws and decide. So the ORC, we're probably not going to change here, right? But the charters within Columbus and the direction, just, I know Mayor Ginther's put out, you know, it's a sanctuary city and all that. There's laws we choose to enforce and not to.
Right.
With marijuana coming legal soon, how are we going to enforce that and not? It needs to be considered now, and it needs to make sure that, especially in the academy, that you're giving the same direction, not you personally, of course, we are giving the same direction to what do you enforce, where's your discretion? Because there's an open door to racism immediately if you're often too much discretion, where you pick and choose who you're enforcing against. We need to be choosing what we're enforcing against.
Right. You're right, therein lies the difficulty. It needs to be at a higher policy level than just individual officer.
Right.
Thank you. Anyone else to add to this conversation?
Well, I'll just go ahead and add my little 2 cents.
This is someone who got caught in a SWAT situation when she was at a car wash.
I was. And thanks to someone who's on CPD, I was able to call him and find out exactly what was going on and why I was trapped at the car wash. It was very helpful. So what we talked about a little bit was how 21st Century kind of embraces a little bit of all of these other subtopics that have been broken off, and the 6 pillars that align with 21st century policing, which I was told today that I'll be doing a presentation on that. So we'll go into detail specifically about each of those. But the other thing is, in addition to the kind of overlapping, what we suggested, or what kept being suggested, is that we have sort of a liaison amongst each of the committees that sort of relays or does some sort of cross-committee communication, so that people know, okay, they're working on this and they have this research that may be able to assist you or something like that. And so we were wondering if, you know, we can.
So I could assign the vice chairs.
That was my idea too. See, we're here. Isn't that what I said? That's what I said. See?
We could assign the vice chairs that role, and then I would guess as the meetings go on after each meeting, if they just have a phone conference, to kind of a check-in
Yeah.
around this, so that we, again, it goes back to your very opening point around redundancy and everything else.
Yeah.
So we're going to have vice chairs as, what did you call them?
The cross-committee liaison.
Cross-committee liaisons. They're going to be the cross-committee liaisons. And we'll figure this out. And really, at the next meeting, if we're scheduling us at 3 or 4 hours, we may have a meeting before Matrix comes in, because we can't do it then. But if we could have the presentation from Dr. Jones, and then to get into the nitty-gritty details of how this is going to work from an organizational perspective. And the sooner we can have that meeting, I think better. Things should go more smoothly in the future. I mean, not that they haven't gone smoothly now, but just as we really are getting into this work, we've got to figure out how to make it work for all of us, okay?
So it seemed like at the different tables that kind of an agenda for each committee and how they were going to look at things and proceed was starting to come together. Are we going to get kind of a report out of, or map kind of what that is? Maybe not tonight, but.
No, we won't be tonight.
Not tonight, but
No.
maybe the next. I just know that the chairs all seemed like they kind of had some points of things that they wanted the committee to go through.
That internal committees need to have conversations with the chairs and to see that so we can report it out. Okay. So, yes. We're just going to be meeting. Anything else? But I do understand that it's so important. So, yeah, so whether, I don't know, someone asked the question, I think it was Andrea earlier, so when is a report expected? What's the time frame for this? And we've just had this rather open-ended. I think when we met the very first time, I shared with you that the mayor hoped to have this work finished by December. I knew that was not realistic. Because there is so much to this work, and we don't want to let what I'd call an artificial time period prevent us from really doing our work. But on the other hand, I operate better when I know what's going to occur when, and we can project when certain things are due, and I think we all will. So I want us to spend some significant time at that next meeting with the commission trying to do that, and not with the help of our team. Okay? Yes, Reggie.
I'm just reflecting on what Ellen mentioned earlier about the cross-pollination of topics for the committees. Yeah, I hear what she's saying, but I've also heard conversations at each of the table when we talked about wellness in several different ways. And so I'm wondering, though, at some point we can synthesize what the committees come up with and group them together rather than from committees, group them by topics. And that way we can kind of address the issues that might be similar instead of just a committee report. So I don't want to lose the creativity of any committee, even though it may be on a similar topic. So however we can do that, we can maybe do both or something like that, but I'd really like to see similar topics kind of grouped together at least so we can, look at them in a similar light.
So an assignment to the committee chairs, with the backup of your vice chairs, could you please summarize what you learned from your tables today and get it to us by the close of business on Thursday? And that would be sending it to me, Ilana, or Brian. 5 o'clock on Thursday. I don't know why she does that. Any other questions?
I do have
Yes.
a question, because I've been wondering about this for some time, but the creation of the Safety Advisory Commission, what is our ultimate goal going to be? Because to Mr. Wilkinson, Commissioner Wilkinson's point, CPD does a lot good. However, I would think that our this deep dive that we're doing into this process should have some ultimate end that ends up saying that we're looking to improve on some aspect of what is being done currently, especially in light of the fact that the relationship between law enforcement and people of color, not only in Columbus, but around the country, has become increasingly more strained. So my question becomes, is that our objective, to look at how we improve that relationship specifically and make recommendations?
That's a part of it. That could be, and that could be more community policing, problem-solving policing. How do you get to that end? How do you get to the end of having better relationships? Right? And so I believe that when we hear about some of these, when we hear, again, other communities have already done this, do they have some good suggestions? But I'm going to go back to what Mayor Ginther said when he met with us the first time. He acknowledged and said in a very positive way, we have a good police department. That doesn't mean we can't get better. And I think that's true of any profession, if you're not constantly in that state of improvement. So that's where my head is. It's not about condemning the department at all. We've got a good department. But how can we make it better for everyone? For the officers and the sworn personnel, and for community.
Indeed, and from my vantage point specifically, I've had the opportunity to sit at these tables and to have access that most people have not had, and so I've had a paradigm shift to some degree. However, communicating how these decisions are made and when they're made and where they're made has to be something that we're going to need to be able to articulate to the people that we also represent as members of this commission, because we were all selected from different parts of the community, right?
And I think when we were talking earlier, and it just hasn't come up, I think one of the things we were specifically talking about, and I think, Galitha, you were at that table, many times the community will react to decisions around what's the punishment or the corrective action that has taken place that involves an officer, and not understanding, well, so-and-so said he should be fired, but so-and-so, all of that's really a part where there's very little understanding from the community. How are those decisions reached? I think that's one thing that we were talking about earlier.
And that is exactly to my point, is that is going to be the underwriting current. When we go and have these community conversations, that is going to be the dominant theme of any conversation we have, is happened to this young person or that person, and then what happened as a result of that. And our ability to articulate that in a way that is going to be satisfactory is either going to push our work forward and begin healing the rift that exists between law enforcement and communities of color, or it's going to drive a deeper wedge there, because it's going to appear as though it's just more bureaucracy and that we're not really delving into the things that are meaningful to these communities, that if we look at the history of policing, that have historically had such a divide. So.
Okay, thank you. A reminder of our work. Any other comments?
I do have one comment.
Yes.
And a request of Dr. Jones to circulate that article that you had mentioned in the one roundtable that I was in. It sounds fascinating to me.
Would you like to share?
So it's on the evolution of policing.
Indeed.
It's a very critical piece, but I'll share it.
Okay.
Well said.
Anything else? Thank you again for a very robust afternoon. I have to admit, it's a little daunting when I think about our work going forward. But, we all said that we would be involved and we would do this. So I want to thank you for being here. There being no further business to come before the commission, you are officially adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.